Hello Thomas fans and welcome once again. Now one thing that I find really cool about Thomas and Friends is you would get 100 people in a room and ask them to rank all episodes, and I don't think you would get any one person who has the same answer as one other, or at least for the same reason. Which is why for my next few videos I will be ranking all the episodes of Thomas and Friends from the first few series. Now as ever, this order is my opinion and my opinion only, so if your list is different to mine, good for you. So, let's start with my least favourite episode. Number 26. Thomas's Christmas Party, the final episode of the series. Now don't get me wrong, I like all these episodes, but this one has quite a few problems in my eyes. Every time I watch this episode, I'm always asking myself the same questions. Here are a few examples. They never made an episode out of Mrs. Kindly's Christmas, so won't some viewers be confused if they haven't read the book? Why did they film some flashback footage of Mrs. Kindly's Christmas if they weren't going to make an episode out of it? Why did the engines leave it a whole year to thank Mrs. Kindly for helping them? If this took place a year ago, wouldn't that mean it was around the time of Thomas, Terence and the snow? And if that's the case, Toby and Percy wouldn't even have been in it. Other than that, this episode is okay. It's always nice to see the railway covered in snow and with loads of Christmas decorations. Oh, one more thing I really don't like is the song at the end. It sounds awful. I mean, this is Ringo Starr singing, a member of the Beatles, and yet he cannot sing We Wish You a Merry Christmas.
We wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Next please. Number 25. Thomas and the Guard. A fairly vanilla episode for me. For most of the episode, you just see Thomas puffing on the track. If you were a viewer who didn't pay attention to dialogue, you probably wouldn't find this episode very appealing. This is the first of 4 consecutive episodes dedicated to Thomas on his branch line, and I'm glad this one comes first. Another thing I hate is how much of a prick Thomas is to Henry. It's one of the things I hate about Thomas's character in his early seasons. That's not being cheeky, that's being arrogant. But this is the character that the kids are supposed to learn from. This is normally the episode I tend to skip when watching this series. Number 24. Thomas's Train. While this episode lets you feel sympathy for Thomas after he leaves the coaches behind, it isn't a favourite of mine at all. Of course, everyone remembers that episode where Thomas was so excited he left before his coaches were cobbled up to him, but for me, everyone remembers it because it was on so many VHS tapes. I had a lot of these tapes, and eventually this episode did grow old on me. But number 23. Thomas and the Trucks. A similar story to Thomas's Train, this one did become quite old after a while. Although it is nice to see all these locations all put together while Thomas takes the trucks, another criticism I have is when the trucks push Thomas down the hill, they don't make it that exciting. I would have thought they would have at least put the runaway theme in this scene, unless Michael Jr. hadn't written it at this point. And also, for some reason, Thomas isn't even going that fast, especially compared to that runaway scene in Dirty Objects. So, in the end, a fairly average episode. Number 22. Thomas in Trouble. I bet a lot of you thought this one was going to be my least favourite. Well, no, I actually don't really mind this episode that much. I agree with most fans that say this one is quite simple in terms of story, but I just find the concept very interesting. In the end, Toby joins the railway simply because he has those cow catchers. This makes perfect sense, and I would go far enough to say that this was one of the best ways to introduce a character in the series. But again, this episode is quite simple, and also, I don't think it's a good way to represent policemen, the people whose duty it is to protect life. Number 21. Thomas Goes Fishing. The second in that group of 4 Thomas episodes. A fairly random story when you think about it. I would love to know where Audrey got that idea from. However, it isn't ranked that high because they don't make it as funny as I feel it should be. I mean, they actually put fish in an engine's boiler. I could see that being in a 70s sitcom. So yeah, they could have made that the scene where they discovered the fish a bit funnier, but then we do get the famous O face, and that's probably the best reaction you can get for anything. Number 20. Thomas and the Breakdown Train. Yes, another Thomas episode. This is probably the most important episode in the Thomas franchise. This is ultimately what makes Thomas the hero of the show, when of course he helps James after he has crashed. The reason this episode is so low, however, is the adventure begins, where we get that amazing chase sequence where Thomas is trying to stop James from crashing. Whereas in the original episode we just see Thomas staying in the siding saying, I'd like to teach those trucks a lesson, and using that O face again. So yeah, a fairly calm episode, which still has a very happy ending, but as the adventure begins proved, the episode could have been better. Number 19. Thomas and Gordon. I think it's a tradition for TV shows to have an okay episode as their first, and Thomas and Friends is no exception. This episode was a great way to establish the characters of Thomas and Gordon. I don't think they could have gone with any other story to kick off the show, even though it wasn't the first to be written into the books. It's nothing spectacular, but still worth a watch. Also, I do like that we get a whole minute of Gordon's theme during the express scene. That one's my favourite of all the character themes.
Come on, Puff Gordon to the coaches.
Number 18. Thomas, Terence and the Snow. What makes this episode so good is how much effort David Misson put into covering the set in snow. It looks so convincing. However, I'm not a huge fan of this episode because they sometimes focus on the uninteresting parts, such as Thomas being annoying to Terence for pretty much no reason, and Thomas not wanting to wear his snowplow. So when he crashes into the snow, it's over with too quickly. I mean, that crash literally took an entire second, which I think is a bit of a letdown. The first ever on-screen crash in the series should have definitely had more drama, but to see the railway covered in snow for the first time is just wonderful. Number 17. Trouble in the Shed. Just like Toby, a very interesting way to introduce a new character. Of course, all three base this story on a real life strike that took place on another railway, and I don't think it could have gone any better. Despite this, it's still only a fairly average episode. The first half with the big engines going on strike is really unusual, but the second half was just okay. Not as good as the previous, and nowhere near as good as what came next. Number 16. James and the Coaches. The first of many episodes to have two ordinary stories put together. I'm glad they went with this, because both stories were relatively short. The episode is pretty much a word-for-word retelling of it, apart from the smartly dressed man not being named, so it doesn't really engage the audience that much. The story is simple, but having the two stories together does improve the episode for me. Number 15. Edward and Gordon. A very nice way to establish Edward's character. Although this was the first story in the Railway series, I'm quite glad this wasn't the first episode of the TV series, because I think Gordon gets a better introduction in Thomas and Gordon. It was very breathtaking to hear Audrey talk about what gave him the idea for the story. Other than that, I think the episode is okay. We feel pleased for Edward when he gets to come out of the shed, and when he is promised a new coat of paint, but there are other episodes that I find a bit more exciting and interesting. Number 14. Thomas and Bertie. The first episode I remember seeing as a baby. These two characters share a great friendship where every single time they talk they challenge each other to a race. It's really amusing. The first race they have is really exciting and quite true to life. Although a bus and a train would never ever have a race in real life, what slows them all down is very realistic. This is a lot of people's favourites, and I can certainly see why, but just like some of the other episodes, it did grow old on me, so it just misses out on being in the top half of the list. Number 13. Down the Mine. A very good episode, even though in the end it doesn't change anything. The crash is a great scene. It has a very appropriate sound effect, and you feel sad when Thomas cries. I love the ending where Thomas and Gordon form an alliance. It gives Gordon a chance to show his good side, a side that unfortunately we rarely get to see, so we can enjoy this episode even more. Number 12. The Sad Story of Henry. As a huge Henry fan, of course I felt sympathy for him when he was shot in the tunnel, but come on, who doesn't find it funny when the Fat Controller is unable to help because of what his doctor says? That scene makes this episode. I'm really glad they put that in The Adventure Begins. No offense to Ringo Starr, but it sounds much funnier when Keith Wickham voiced him.
Top him hat.
My doctor has forbidden me to pull.
Other than that, the story is a bit silly and unrealistic in places, but the funny scenes make it all worth it. Number 11. Toby and the Stout Gentleman. I'm sure it was quite surprising when out of nowhere came this episode about this character named Toby that nobody had seen before, and puffing through locations we haven't seen before. Everyone's wondering what this has to do with Thomas and his friends, and they explained it perfectly in Thomas in Trouble. But this episode is so much better because the locations look amazing on Toby's old railway, and the writers ensured that we feel sad for Toby when his railway was closing, and we cheer for him when the Fat Controller invites him to Sodor. I've said it once and I'll say it again. This was one of the best ways to introduce a character, and if Andrew Brenner continues retelling the old stories, I would really look forward to seeing his version of Toby's story. Number 10. James and the Express. A fairly calm, basic episode, I'll admit, but it's good that James gets his big break and pulls the Express, because after this, he's always been eager to take it, almost frighteningly so. As ever, it's amusing to see Gordon have a problem after acting like he knows it all previously, and he and James do become good friends, once again showing that kind heart that Gordon has. A nice, pleasant episode. Number 9. Edward, Gordon and Henry. Actually, forget what I said about Thomas and the Breakdown Train. This was the most important story in the franchise. Why? Because if this story hadn't been written and Henry hadn't been let out of the tunnel, the first book never would have been published, and we'd have probably never heard the name Thomas the Tank Engine. As for the episode, it's a really nice way to let Henry be the hero and show that he didn't deserve to stay in that tunnel. I'm glad that in the end, the three main engines all become great friends, and as I said before, this episode has had a bigger influence on the franchise than any other, so it deserves to be high on this list. Number 8. Cole. Due to it not being on many of the VHS tapes, I first saw this episode rather late in my childhood. Of course, as I always do, I felt incredibly sorry for Henry for when he was unwell, and when he receives the Welsh coal, he seems like a new engine. However, like many, I am incredibly annoyed that having special coal is his only other personality trait in the current series, of course, apart from being a terrified child. This episode showed that everyone was finally taking Henry's illness seriously, but the best was still yet to come for Henry, as I'll show you later. Number 7. Tenders and Turntables. Quite a nice, fun episode, which again proved that Thomas and friends can have good comedy material. When Gordon has to pull his train backwards and James gets spun on the turntable, you can't help but at least smile just a little bit. Also, this ends on a pretty dramatic cliffhanger. I mean, I can imagine some viewers would have been surprised when Ringo said the engines were about to go on strike. It immediately makes you excited to see the next episode, even though it wasn't quite as good as this. So, really an episode of two genres, both comedy and drama, a rare thing for Thomas and friends. Number 6. Dirty Objects. Another really memorable episode with a brilliant crash. I'm not much of a fan of the first minute where James is just being an asshole to Toby and then grumbling when he's sorting out the trucks. I just think it makes the whole runaway and crash scene over and done with too quickly. The build up to the crash is pretty exciting as well because you immediately know that something's going to happen and James is going to get his just desserts. We also get this really humorous line that only really works if you have your eyes closed.
Something sticky splashed all over James.
While this episode has a storyline we see multiple times in other stories, it shows that James still has that arrogant behaviour we all know and love, and we also know that's never going to change. Number 5. Troublesome Trucks. A good way to finish off the establishment of James's character. This one showed that James can be a hero and we should take him seriously. Despite it being unrealistic, I like the bit when some of the trucks are uncoupled and roll back down the hill. Although it happens a lot, it does look quite appropriate in this episode. The ending is really good and you do feel glad that James gets to keep his red paint. Although of course in the end all this goes to James's head. Number 4. Percy runs away. After very briefly introducing Percy in Trouble in the Shed, the very next episode gave Percy more time to develop character. And boy did he. I have very good memories of seeing the episode for the first time. It was the first episode on a VHS called Chases, Races and Runaways, which I got at Christmas in 2004. The scene where Gordon just avoids hitting Percy and then Percy runs for his life just blew me away with its intensity and fast-paced action. I might be wrong, but I think I put that episode on 5 times that day. Yes, I was that much of a fan in those days. This episode has always been a favourite and I think that will never change. A brilliant way to properly introduce the second main character in the series. Number 3. Whistles and Sneezes. For a long time this really was my favourite episode of Series 1. Once again, I'm glad they put 2 Railway Series stories together into one because they do go well together. The first half of Gordon's whistle I find is okay. It's amusing to once again see Gordon get humiliated in front of his colleagues, but it cannot match the second half of Henry's sneeze. This second story makes this episode. Again, I would love to know if we'll rebase this on something that had actually happened in real life. Henry punishing those boys by sneezing at them is absolutely hilarious. Although they very rarely use some of the larger human models, I'm glad they used them to show the boys' reactions to it, and the ashes of their face. If it wasn't for the average first half, this episode might move to at least second in the list. Number 2, Off the Rails. The start of a very recurring storyline for Gordon. I don't think I'll ever get bored of the episodes where Gordon gets up to humiliating situations and we get his oh so famous catchphrase, "Oh, the indignity." In my opinion, this was the first episode that had Gordon as the primary character, so we still hadn't quite got to know him in a leading role, and Off the Rails was just the one to start. Through this installment, we learned what lengths Gordon would take to avoid pulling trucks, and also we would see Gordon feel a sense of shame rather than just embarrassment. The scene where they're getting Gordon out of the ditch is very well done, even though it is done at night. The song is still not that good. Did Bricko just forget how to sing when recording his lines for this? More importantly, we feel sorry for Gordon and know that he isn't the villain of the show. He has feelings as well. This episode was brilliant, but it's probably never going to be good enough to beat by number 1. And number 1, well, of course it's the Flying Kipper, isn't it? This episode is not only the best chapter of season 1, but for many, one of the best of all 20 seasons. If you ask me if the Flying Kipper wasn't in this series, I'd find series 1 only average. Most of the episodes in this one aren't spectacular, and they will pretty much meet the expectations of somebody who had read the books countless times and wanted to see these come to life. I'd read the Flying Kipper story in the book multiple times, but I had no idea what the episode in the TV series would be like. And when I saw it for the first time on a VHS tape, rather late in my childhood, it was even better than I expected. The music is triumphant, the visuals look amazing, the crash is spectacular, and the ending, where Henry gets his new shape, is very touching. This episode was epic from beginning to end, and I cannot recommend it enough. So, what are my final thoughts on season 1? Well, it's not the best season. The best was yet to come at this point. Overall, I would rank this series number 5 out of the first 7, ahead of season 6. If I could title it, I would call it the Peter Davison season, because it is so similar to his run as Doctor Who. A lot of okay episodes, but one fantastic episode, namely The Caves of Androzani. So, what are your thoughts? Is your list different to mine, and what's your opinion on season 1? Let me know down in the comments. As always, thanks for watching, and until next time, sparkle, sparkle, sparkle.